Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here. Thank you for joining us tonight for the opening event of our third annual CIGU conference, Energy, Capital, Metabolism. I'm Neil Brenner. Most of you know me already, I think. I'm the chair of CIGU. I'm also on faculty in the sociology department. Before I turn the proceedings over to my friend and colleague, Fredrik Jonsson, who is going to offer some framing remarks about the conference theme and introduce our distinguished keynote speakers, my role is to say a few words about CIGU, and also I have some thank yous to offer to various friends and colleagues for helping us do this conference. So I want to talk about the question, why CIGU and why now? So the idea for CIGU was developed during the closing months of the COVID-19 global pandemic, a period in which global carbon emissions were diminished as major states around the world engaged in various forms of lockdown. The brief drop in global CO2 emissions amidst COVID followed a decade in which social movements against continued fossil energy use and global climate inaction had gained considerable momentum around the world. Their efforts led to important policy changes to encourage investment in renewable energy and to phase out reliance upon fossil-fueled infrastructures and machines. And amidst the international commitments that were enshrined in the Paris Agreement of 2016, these social movements helped create significant new momentum to advance strategies of decarbonization, to repair inherited forms of socio-environmental destruction, to develop new ways of preserving biodiversity, and to address entrenched forms of socio-environmental injustice. 4 years later, as we open this conference, planetary prospects for addressing proliferating climate and nature emergencies appear exceedingly bleak. In absolute terms, global CO2 emissions are rising more quickly than ever before in human history. While investments in renewable energy continue to expand in some global regions, most notably in China, they have contributed to an overall increase in energy consumption globally. And the share of fossil fuels, even as we add renewables, continues to grow significantly. Since 2020, fossil energy companies have been substantially expanding their infrastructures of extraction and production. They have also reaped record profits, generally with strong financial backing and direct political support from major governments. And meanwhile, including significantly here in the United States, new political coalitions have been established that are committed to the continued expansion of fossil energy use to support the pursuit of economic growth. In many cases, again, including here in the United States, such strategies are grounded upon a denial. Such strategies are grounded upon a denial of basic scientific facts regarding the causes of global warming and climate change, and an assault on the research institutions, and in many cases, the researchers that produce essential scientific knowledge about such issues. And meanwhile, purported climate solutions are being advanced that in actual fact further entrench or expand the role of fossil energy. And amidst this turbulent geopolitical environment, the devastating impacts of climate change are proliferating and intensifying around the world in various forms: extreme weather, flooding, superstorms, megafires, and drought, to name just a few. In wave after wave of disaster and destruction, these processes are degrading and destroying everyday systems of habitation and ecosystems around the world, inducing widespread social suffering, displacement, food insecurity, trauma, disease, and death among humans, and mass extinctions across the planetary biosphere. Despite the Paris Agreement's binding commitment to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above Holocene temperature averages, we now appear to be entering what Andreas Malm and Wim Carton have recently described as an era of overshoot, an era in which dominant institutions and actors focus their resources upon managing the devastation unevenly associated with climate and nature emergencies rather than addressing the root causes, namely fossil capital. And many of these responses permit or even intensify the continued expansion of fossil energy investment and consumption in the name of economic growth targets. And they also exacerbate the closely related problem of biodiversity loss, above all through unfettered deforestation. The increasingly hegemonic assumption appears to be that new technologies will be developed at some point in the future, for instance, through carbon capture or climate geoengineering, that might alleviate the catastrophic impacts of fossil energy use and biodiversity loss and lay the groundwork for a putatively sustainable model of economic growth. As Mike Davis commented over a decade ago about the IPCC's approach to climate governance, we have, and I quote, bet the ranch, or rather the planet, on a market-driven evolution towards a post-carbon world economy, end quote. So this is the grim planetary context in which SIGU seeks to contribute to scholarship, pedagogy, and public engagement at the University of Chicago and beyond. Our central mission is to advance historically grounded, spatially attuned, holistic, public-facing, and critically oriented forms of research and teaching in environmental social science, environmental humanities, and the arts. Our faculty and students are centrally concerned with questions of theory, conceptualization, representation, and the politics of environmental knowledge, because interpretations fundamentally shape pretty much everything that I've just described in the last few minutes. The operations of technology, investment practices, institutional logics, material life, everyday life. We are in equal measure systematically engaged with questions of environmental injustice. The uneven sociospatial impacts of climate and nature emergencies have deep historical roots related to the pathways of global capitalist development. Sorry, I lost my place. They have deep historical roots related to the pathways of global capitalist development, empire, colonialism, state formation, resource extraction, energy production and consumption, environmental transformation and degradation, and political mobilization and insurgency around the world. Our faculty and students are deeply engaged with debates on environmental policy and political strategies, while situating the latter within broader historical, geopolitical, and geographical frameworks that are attuned to the question of root causes, not only of contemporary climate and nature emergencies, but of our abject failure to adequately deal with them up to this point. Finally, SIGU engages with the diverse cultural formations that shape and are shaped by socio-environmental relations and conditions, whether in literature, film, the visual arts, performance, or design practices. These media offer powerful windows into the life worlds of experience that animate the transformation of environments and that shape the imagination of possible human and biospheric futures. So in short, we embrace a transdisciplinary framework that uniquely combines theories, methods, and insights from across the environmental, social sciences, humanities, and arts, always in active dialogue and collaboration with key streams of scholarship in the ecological, biological, and geophysical sciences, as well as within the design disciplines. We seek to train our students to think critically, independently, and holistically about socio-environmental transformations across space and time, and through their studies with us, SIGU students gain essential and urgently needed capacities to investigate and we hope ultimately to shape our collective planetary future with scientific knowledge, practical intelligence, and creative imagination, as well as with an orientation towards the biospheric commons upon which all life depends. So we've been working hard these last couple of years. We've got a lot going on. I think as people in this room will know, we have a flourishing undergraduate major. We have a flourishing, relatively new doctoral certificate that I think a number of doctoral students in the room are part of. Our faculty are vibrant and creative and active and dedicated in research and in teaching, and that brings a lot of solidarity and inspiration, I think, across the community. And we also organize different events, including events like this one, which are an opportunity to reflect on what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we might do it in the future in relation to a changing, crisis-riven world. So we're deeply grateful to everyone within and beyond the University of Chicago who has participated in and contributed to our work in SIGU in a time in which our planetary environmental situation appears extremely dire. SIGU's community of scholarship and learning offers what I think of as a space of hope. It provides thinkers of various generations with substantial intellectual resources to understand the origins of our current predicament, and on this basis, to explore possible pathways towards a more livable, equitable, and vibrant planetary future for all. So that's what we're doing and why we're doing it, at least as I understand it. Let me now just offer some brief words of thanks to various friends and colleagues who have helped make all of this possible. Our annual conference is significantly funded through a generous gift from the Redekop family, who have also made possible SIGU's Redekop family environmental research grants to support PhD students and undergrads in their work in environmental studies. Many students in the room have been the recipients of this generous award. And the Redekop family's support has also enabled us to produce this conference. Our keynote lectures tonight are the third annual Calvin and Freda Redekop Lecture in Environment and Society. Calvin Redekop did his PhD in, I believe, sociology at the University of Chicago, and Calvin and Freda Redekop were passionate supporters of social and environmental justice, gender equality, and environmental protection. To honor their commitment to these issues, the Redekop family created the Just Pax Fund and the Redekop Family Endowment, and it's on this basis that they have generously supported our work within SIGU. Calvin and Freda's sons, Bill, Fred, and Ben, are unable to attend the conference, but they send their greetings to all of you and their well wishes to all of us for the conference. We're deeply grateful to the Redekop family for their generous support of our work in SIGU. And finally, let me take this opportunity to express deepest thanks to several wonderful colleagues who have done the administrative and organizational heavy lifting to organize the event. So first of all, the conceptualization of the event was actually a joint effort between Fredrik, Albritton, Jonsson, Ryan Jobson, and Elizabeth Chatterjee, and I played a small role as well. Thank you, comrades. Much appreciation, as always. We are hugely grateful to Sheena Finnegan of the Department of History for massive organizational and logistical support. We'll be thanking her many times in the next day or so. And thanks yet again, as always, are due to our wonderful colleague, Carlo Diaz, who's in the back of SIGU, for his brilliant communications work related to the event website, outreach, video recording, and other matters. And a sincere thanks, I don't know if she's in the room, but to Ariana Chiapas, instructional assistant in SIGU, for steadfast and always cheerful support on a number of extremely essential matters, enabling us to make this event possible. And last but not least, thank you so much to all of you for being here, for your intellectual engagement with the work that we're doing. I look forward eagerly to a very stimulating evening and to more on the way tomorrow. And with that, I'll turn it over to Fredrik, Albritton, Jonsson, who will introduce the actual keynotes. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Great to see so many of our community here. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, our keynote speakers tonight. But before I do that, I'll just speak very briefly to the theme of this conference. And one way to do that is to note that Neil and I, for 2 years now, have been co-teaching a class on climate change, social theory, and history, where we've been in this wonderful conversation about these three terms and how they connect. So what I'm about to say now really is reflecting on a long conversation with Neil, but also other colleagues like Liz and Aaron and Ryan, and our wonderful colleague and graduate student, Sachaet Pandey. So here goes. Now, I'm going to imagine most of you have some notion of what energy is, and probably most of you have thought about capital one way or another. It's really the third term that might require some explication, so I'll concentrate on that. And it'll take me about 3 minutes, but please bear with me. How to define metabolism? Well, At the level of living organisms, of course, it's a way to think about how organisms reproduce themselves, through food, air, water, etc. At the level of societies, the social metabolism describes how societies reproduce themselves in the sense of material and energy inputs, as well as waste and heat at the other end. Now, how do we connect metabolism with energy and capital? Well, one simple concept to use here that really comes out of my conversations with Neil is metabolic intensification. Metabolic intensification. What do we mean by that? We mean the process by which energy is enlisted in the social metabolism to increase processes of extraction, production, consumption, and therefore always waste. Metabolic intensification, in other words, is the process by which we understand how energy gets embodied, right? Energy is always a means to some metabolic end, right? The oxen plowing the wheat field, the coke smelting pig iron furnace, the gasoline in the chainsaw. Metabolic intensification operates at many different scales. At the planetary level, imagine metabolic intensification as a reciprocal, interrelated, complex flow of energy and resources between the biosphere, the geosphere, and the hydrosphere. At the national scale and at the imperial scale, we can take the example of Britain in the Industrial Revolution to think through the meaning of the term. In Britain, the canal network allowed coal to flow from coal districts into urban centers, right? So water made the fossil fuel economy, right? In other words, biosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere interacting. The same process of fossil intensification in Britain also led to the increased rate of land use change on the imperial periphery. Deforestation, plantation agriculture released more carbon into the atmosphere than the fossil emissions in the industrial metropole. So there's a very, I think, very interesting challenge to the thesis of fossil capital, that it's all about the chimneys of Manchester. No, the metabolic intensification here helps us see that it's a dual process, land use change and industrial emissions. We can also scale down the metabolism to the level of technology and individual bodies. In Britain, fossil energy made possible a new built environment, wrought iron, bricks, and cement, as well as a dietary transition centered on a heavy meat, wheat, and sugar diet, and new standards of hygiene, of childcare, of thermal comfort, and eventually a revolution in public health with a drop in infant mortality and a shift, a demographic transition and a shift in family regimes. But that's all important. But let me take the iconic case for the fossil revolution, the steam engine, to walk you through what I mean by metabolic intensification. We usually think of the steam engine as a converter of heat from coal into kinetic energy. But less often do we think about the material inputs that made each engine run, including iron, steel, copper, oak, leather, urine, blood, and tallow. I'll take the last example. James Watt, in his instructions to how to build a steam engine in 1779, recommended that the piston inside the cylinder had to be lubricated once a week with 2 pounds of tallow. What is tallow? Tallow is a form of animal fat harvested from sheep and cows. In the late 18th century, 90% of British tallow imports came from Russia. 90%. Without this input of animal fat, the Industrial Revolution would have ground to a halt, the individual machines as well as the collective process. So there's a very nice case of metabolic intensification, crossing paths with capital and energy. My final point about metabolic intensification moves us into the realm of culture and politics. Consider, for example, the impact of the science of geology and geological maps on British middle-class politics. the first maps of Britain's mineral endowment, the first national maps of coal and iron and other kinds of mineral endowments, came into being at the turn of the century 1800. These were not simply milestones in stratigraphy and geology, but also a new way to imagine the nation and the destiny of the empire. God had created the British mineral endowment to make a global empire. This was the feeling among many of the people who constructed these maps and consumed them. But just as important as these new representations of metabolic intensification were the temporal sensibility associated with the new metabolism, the rise of mechanical time, a sense of technological acceleration, a new notion of the future as dynamic and expansive, and perhaps most important of all, a political expectation of economic growth and rising living standards. So there we're flipping the idea of metabolic intensification into a subjective mode of consciousness, right? This is how we've internalized metabolic intensification. And this final point is perhaps also in the end the best explanation for why the current fossil regime has proven so difficult to dislodge. It is, of course, a matter of capital, of fossil fuel giants manipulating public awareness. But I think it's equally a bottom-up reluctance to address the deep-seated, deep-lodged habits, sensibilities, the phenomenology of fossil fuel and metabolic intensification that structure the way we are in the world. In short, to quote my colleague Dipesh Chakrabarti, fossil freedom. So that's where we are, I think. And that's why we felt we needed to include this term. We're going to continue talking about how these concepts connect, of course, tonight and also all day tomorrow. And I hope you'll all join us for the full event of the conference. But now I really need to get on with the introductions. So let me start. We're beginning with Dominic, I think, right? No, sorry. I had it wrong. Laleh? Yeah, sorry. Laleh Khalili. If it's okay, I'll just introduce both of you at once. Yeah. So Laleh Khalili is a professor of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter and the author of 7 books, including most recently, Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula with Verso 2020, and The Corporeal Life of Seafaring with Mac Books 2023, and soon to come, right? Extractive Capitalism with Profile Books. She is currently researching the afterlives of nationalization of oil in the late 20th century. Sorry, and you can tell which century is always on my mind. And then our second speaker, our second keynote, is Dominic, who is an anthropologist, media maker, and co-founder of the field of energy humanities. His research centers on the politics of energy transition and decarbonization, green infrastructure, environmental justice and civil power, and climate adaptation in coastal cities. And among his many, many books, the latest one, I believe, is called No More Fossils, University of Minnesota Press, 2023, which is an analysis of fossil gerontocracy that seeks to hold us in its ecocidal grasp and the coming transition from petroculture to electroculture. And congratulations to Dominic. We just heard the wonderful news that you won a Guggenheim. Well done. All right. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and now we look forward to our speakers.
I don't have a...
Yeah, sorry, I'm just... No, that's my deck. Good, okay.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all.
I want to start by first thanking the organizing committee for the conference for inviting me. I love Chicago. It's really lovely to be back here. Thank you so much for that. And I also want to, I'm not sure she's here, but I want to say thank you to Sheena, who's just like the goddess of organization, just unbelievable. It's really lovely also to see some old friends here, Aaron, Liz, Zach, and of course Ryan. And it's great to be amongst you. I also wanted to mention that I actually arrived in the US on Friday last week. And my husband and I, my husband's sitting in the back for all his sins. He's not an academic, he's hanging out with the muggles, he said. He's the muggle, we're the wizards. Never mind. Anyway, we have been driving actually to his hometown of Middletown, Ohio. For the last week. Middletown, Ohio is, of course, also the hometown of J.D. Vance. And going through the driving from Chicago to Ohio was a really interesting experience because I have lived in the US, I lived in Texas, I lived in the South, I lived in New York, but I've never really been to the Midwest in the proper way that we were this time, in the sense that I've been to Chicago and Cleveland, but never really traveled in the countryside. And one of the things that was really interesting was to see the layer upon layer of history. So you do see these little brown historic signs, and what they mark are the devastation and dispossession of the indigenous populations of these parts of the country, the ignominious histories of slavery. And then you see these massive agribusiness fields in the flatlands of Indiana. And what you see is, of course, exactly what Fredrik was just talking about, the kind of agribusiness that produces, that devastates the environment, kills the soil, and produces God knows what. It's also really interesting to actually go through this kind of a post-industrial area, because what you do see is this kinds of infrastructures that were established in order precisely to allow for the flow of fossil fuels. First, the coal that was dug up in West Virginia and Kentucky, and the Appalachian, and then oil and the transportation of all of these materials through extensive canal systems, which are now either paved over or are being turned into entertainment areas. So the idea of a kind of a metabolic energy system is one that you can see by driving about an hour outside of Chicago. But also this incredible history, and this is all preamble, I'm not even getting to my talk yet, is what we see haunting current US politics. And that current US politics is also playing out in the parts of the world I'm from. And so what we're seeing is the haunting of this particular kind of capitalist production based on fossil and its effects through, for example, the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, which I think I absolutely should acknowledge at this moment. Because in fact, that genocide is being fueled on the one hand by the United States war machine, and literally fueled in the sense that the jet fuel that is being used, there's 30,000 gallons of jet fuel goes into a 1-hour sortie to bomb Gaza. And all of that jet fuel comes from Texas. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And then also being on a university campus to acknowledge that the imperial boomerang is here. I did my PhD at Columbia, which I'm now ashamed to admit. So that was all the preamble. And I felt like that had to be mentioned in a conference in which we're speaking about oil, because of course we also know that the biggest producers in the region are completely and totally complicit with what Israel is doing. And not only complicit there, but they're also complicit in places like Sudan, where the United Arab Emirates is supporting the RSF in their genocide and pillage and rape activities. So with that acknowledgement, that grim acknowledgement, I'm going to go to the project that I'm working on right now, which is about measurement of molecules. Okay, the story I want to tell today is a historic account. And although its scope is global, I want it to be attentive to global inequalities, so not quite a generic or an equal one. In 1946, a geology textbook that I was looking up mentions that 57% of the world's known petroleum reserves were held by US interests, meaning oil companies based in the US. 25% by British Dutch interests, basically BP and Shell, or Anglo-Iranian and Shell, 14% by the USSR, and the rest by France, Mexico, and residual others of about 1%. So this is really important. 57% were held by the US, 25% by the British. So that's about 80% of the world reserve that was being exploited in the world everywhere was actually held by the United States and Britain. Over the course of the next 30 years, after 1946, during the period of decolonization, the struggle for nationalization of oil resulted in what Chris Dietrich has called the largest transfer of wealth in peacetime in history. This transfer wrought transformations that were seismic, both in the short and the long term. In the immediate aftermath of nationalization, because the Seven Sisters no longer suppressed oil prices, the cost of a barrel of oil nearly tripled. Cheap fossil fuel that had driven the affluence of post-war US, Europe, and Japan, and had underwritten the Marshall Plan, and had also already set into motion the climate crisis that afflicts us, essentially, the moment of cheap fossil fuel ended in that moment. Oil-producing countries that had seen their patrimony expatriated planned massive investments in infrastructure, health, and education, but also in the expansion of the oil and gas, indeed of petrochemicals and plastics. It is worth noting that in all the major countries where such investments were made, short of revolutionary Iran and the US proxies in the Gulf, these advances have been rolled back through successive sanctions and wars waged by the US. I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about Venezuela, I'm talking about Libya, you name it. The massive balance of payment crisis that followed the nationalization of oil sent many countries of the global south into recession, drove many industries there to bankruptcy, and devastated agricultural communities everywhere in the global south. A vast population of what Vivek Bald in another context has called hypermobile but hyper-exploited group of workers emerged out of that moment. They were seafarers, they were migrant workers, and they were refugees of war and climate change. And these hypermobile but hyper-exploited groups of workers essentially went on to serve the needs of capital in places as far afield as California, Fortress Europe, Hong Kong, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and of course the affluent city-states of the Gulf. Please note that I do not distinguish between these categories of hypermobility, the refugees, the migrant workers, and the seafarers, because essentially the causes of their itinerancy is at least partially because of the ascendancy of petroleum, but because of the different stages of course, petroleum exploitation. But beyond the geopolitical, this nationalization of oil also shaped the contours and character of US imperial power and the nature of capitalisms thereafter. I want to point to this multiplicity of capitalist formations, but make a claim that all of them changed. These changes entailed the creation of oil trading and derivatives, the transformation of the world's shipping and logistics industries, the petrodollar, weapons dollar fungibility, the emergence of sovereign wealth funds, in fact. First Norway and Kuwait, now Qatar, Abu Dhabi and Saudi, and soon the United States, as major global economic, but also political and geopolitical players. This story cannot be told without a brief recap of the fundamental effect of Middle Eastern oil production on the emergence of what is called neoliberalism in the global north. As an aside, the complex state and corporate relations that we call neoliberalism here had in fact been a feature of colonial and neocolonial economies for a long time, so those functions were already tested elsewhere. If you read three different books together, Stephen Galpern's Money, Oil and Empire in the Middle East, along with Francis Gavin's Gold, Dollar and Power, and Catherine Schenk's The Decline of the Sterling, it becomes clear that the Kuwaiti overproduction of oil acted as a double blind for Britain. The British post-Second World War balance of payments, dependence on the Anglo-Iranian oil company holdings in Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and on the Suez Canal Company also meant that Britain was particularly vulnerable to the wave of anti-colonial movements that nationalized these invisible benefits, quote unquote, from the foreign investment in public-private ownerships of oil companies abroad. the forced devaluation of the sterling in 1967 in response to these decolonization processes was one of the main factors in the gradual US move towards the end of the Bretton Woods systems. The incredible gold, dollars, and power history, which traces that shift of decoupling the dollar from the gold in 1971, actually really starts being triggered off by the sterling devaluation that was completely and totally related to oil. Gavin's detailed account of the run-up to Nixon's 15 August 1971 announcement of the floating of the dollar makes clear that Nixon and his economically nationalist Secretary of Treasury, John Connolly, in what seems like an echo of the policies of today, decided to sunder dollars' already frayed links to gold, to force the valuation of major competing currencies, and to set in motion the finance-dominated world in which we live. The motto of that moment was, as it is today, something that Connolly said: foreigners are out to screw us, our job is to screw them first. Sounds pretty familiar. If during Britain's empire of coal, the sterling had been the global currency, the exorbitant privilege already embedded in the dollar by the Bretton Woods agreements was consolidated by the US empire of oil. And it is fascinating to see the Trump administration's know-nothings actually sunder that, that exorbitant privilege through their extraordinarily self-destructive behavior. Now, I lay out this story, which is familiar to everybody and is probably putting you to sleep, because of the cascade of ensuing changes, which I'm going to be focusing on a little bit more closely. In the countries of the global north, and I now focus specifically on the US and UK in particular, the nationalization of oil and the jettisoning of the fixed exchange rates also led to an avalanche of new laws, bylaws, standards, and regulations. Not just the Congress or the Parliament, but the private sector and trade associations scrambled to reimagine a world in which the British and the US did not control the primary engine of capital accumulation, oil. In this world, nevertheless, capital was accumulated hand over fist. The story I want to tell begins with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and its category-defying corporate practices. Anglo-Persian was established in 1909, and 51% of its stock was purchased by the British government in 1914, giving the state a considerable say in the way the company ran. A vast amount has been written about Anglo-Persian, which eventually became British Petroleum, but here it is important to note a few things. Until 1928, when the British legislated accounting reporting standards for companies, APOC basically had to only report the details of any kind of accounting it did to the British government. Despite the fact that until their later discoveries in Iraq, Iran was the most significant source of oil, but it was in receipt of very paltry sums, paltry rents. APOC had no financial accounting obligations to Iran, nor was it even willing to open its books to the Iranian government. As a memorandum drafted by two Swiss international lawyers and an Iranian nationalist parliamentarian argued in 1949, the company used everything from the shifting value of the gold standard to the rules around British taxation, which saw the British government levy taxes against Iranian incomes from the oil produced by APOC, to ensure the asymmetric accumulation of capital in Britain rather than in Iran. In her Machineries of Oil, Katayun Shafei writes about the way a seemingly straightforward concept such as profit was a source of dispute between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the Iranian governments. The conflict was over everything down to, for example, the interpretation of 16% of the annual net profits, which gave the British government and then, of course, APOC, the ability to use the expanding complexity of financial and accounting arrangements of the company. That phrase comes from what the British Petroleum was saying, as a way of challenging Iranian government or pushing back the challenge of Iranian government for more of a share of rents. So the British essentially tried to change the meaning of the word profit through accounting definitions in order to allow them to push back against Iranian claims. Shafei writes, Central to the company's strategy of manipulating scales and formulas for establishing the basis of royalty payments was Anglo-Iranians' control of the oil production variable. The strategy also involved putting limits on the working possibilities in the calculation of royalties. For example, by controlling certain strategic variables such as minimum and maximum tonnage and royalty payments. This, company officials hoped, would build boundaries, blocking access to accounting information and producing the effect of techno-economic concerns as a separate from political questions of sovereignty and national control. What we're doing is just technical stuff, right? This is just facts of accounting. What are you doing? This is not about politics, is basically what they were saying. In this process of manipulation of accounts, discount pricing for in-house movement of oil, by in-house I mean moving from Iran, but moving to refineries elsewhere, transportation premiums, special contracts, often with military entities, for example, the Admiralty, and in the case of what became Aramco with the US military, and specific provisions having to do with the value of sterling had a material effect on concepts such as revenues, costs, and profits. Now, I'm interested in this because aside from the fact that my husband's an accountant and I'm trying to learn everything from him, I think there is a particularly interesting element of question of expertise in here, which is that the more jargon you use, the more people's eyes glaze over, kind of like right now. So part of that really was about creating a language that was inaccessible, a language of expertise that was inaccessible. The keeping of oil accounting in-house was not limited to the Gulf, in part because of the ownership structure and vertical integration of the oil companies, and in part because of the process of education and certification of professions were tightly constrained by both political context and policy considerations. In her brief history of accounting in Trinidad and Tobago, you probably know this one already, Marcia Anisette explains that because the oil company in the country had to report to the company's house in the UK, the accounting expertise and rules and provisions were also imported from Britain. So you couldn't even establish your own individual rules because everything else was being reported outside of the country. The first independent accountants to arrive in Trinidad and Tobago from Britain from the 1930s onwards, was independent as in not working for the oil company, was nevertheless a British chartered accountant who worked according to the rules of Britain in Trinidad and Tobago. So it was everywhere that there was an oil company, the establishment and professionalization of the rules of accounting, calculation of profits, calculation of incomes, was imported from whoever was the imperial boss. As the cataclysmic structures for resource sovereignty gained speed in the 1960s, so did the awareness in the global north of the extent of multinational presence overseas. Concurrent with this awareness, and likely the cause of it, were the gathering omens of these very multinationals losing their unfettered access to the resources they had considered unquestionably their own, through concession agreements which effectively gave them sovereignty not only to resources, but even to political, economic, and market processes in the countries where the resources resided. Here I'm, for example, referring to the arbitration ruling in the case of Aramco versus Saudi Arabia in the late 1950s around the Onassis case. Basically, Aristotle Onassis, for those who don't know this story, it's a really great story. Aristotle Onassis, who then went on to marry Jackie Kennedy, JFK's widow, which is something kind of surprising that a lot of Americans didn't know that. Anyway, so Aristotle Onassis makes a deal with the Saudi government to set up a transportation company. To transport the oil that Aramco, at the time a US-held company, to transport the oil that Aramco is producing out of the country. This was a couple of years after the attempted nationalization of the Iranian oil, and the Americans freak out because they think, oh my God, Saudi must be thinking that they're going to nationalize, because why else would you want to transport your own oil, you know? And so they put everything in motion. The CIA flies with a check for $1 million to the king of Saudi Arabia. Onasis's British rivals, British and Greek rivals, including Stavros Niarchos, start meeting with various people. There's talk among the Dulles brothers of finding some way to challenge this. There's all sorts of chicanery going on behind the scenes. Ultimately, a case is lodged, an arbitration case is lodged with an international arbitration court against Saudi Arabia. And this international arbitration case, the judges on it essentially rule that the concession agreement that Saudi Arabia had signed in 1933 was a document of sovereignty. And that phrase comes from the case. And it gave Aramco sovereignty over the decision to sell oil out of Saudi Arabia. So essentially, this was what the multinationals did, right? So you had the copper companies doing the same, ITT doing the same in Chile. You had other multinationals that controlled the flow of rubber from Malaysia, for example. And all of them had, because of the concession agreement, according to these arbitral courts that were sitting often in Europe, they had sovereignty over not only over the resources, but also over the goods of these other places. Now, because of this, precisely these kinds of cases, it was becoming clear, obviously to the people in the global south, that those concession agreements was a way to hand over your sovereignty to these multinational corporations. But these multinational corporations also began, because of solidarity movements, because of different kinds of activism, and because of the anti-colonial struggles, that became that kind of a power that these multinationals were exercising overseas, ended up also becoming quite a significant factor in the global north. Now, this all came to a head once the vertical integration within the Seven Sisters was unraveled. The Seven Sisters being the 7 big oil companies that had held these resources. Already, before this moment, legislation to determine various aspects of accounting policies, various accounting bodies in the global north, they had all begun to establish clear guidelines on how to think through the accounts of extractive industries. Until then, until this moment of nationalization, the companies had some degree of discretion in choice of methods of accounting, in particular as it pertained to the movement of the commodities and associated values within the supply chain across borders. So until this moment of nationalization, basically the oil companies could do the accounting. It had a huge amount of discretion over how they did that accounting. But 1971 saw the first instance, and part of this was also because of this whole entire complexion of processes, including the start of what people call neoliberalism, the end of the Bretton Woods system. 1971 sees the first instance of the US-based AICPA, the American Institute of CPAs, providing clear guidelines in how to think about transnational corporations. 2 particular accounting interventions become quite crucial, and their significance is attested to by the fact that there are whole US congressional hearings on them. The first is the idea of cost centers, which provide a variegated policy of depreciation and amortization to different sites of extraction within the same company. So if you have a reserve in West Pennsylvania, versus you have a reserve in an oil reserve, meaning an oil sort of well or reservoir somewhere else, you can depreciate these differently. You can introduce these as costs or expenses differently. And that's quite an interesting thing. Why? Obviously, because you're trying to maintain a kind of a difference in the ways in which these places are valued. And the second policy is, sorry, let me just go on with this one first. The second policy is transfer pricing, but I'll come to that. A cost center is an area of company that generates costs rather than profits. The 1973 AICPA guidelines made oil field cost centers rather than regions or subsidiaries or countries, thus allowing for expenses of exploration for every oil field to be written off individually, rather than aggregated under a larger heading, i.e. taxes or Canada. The justification was that the unraveling of vertical integration and the specific characteristic of each field required this kind of a detailed knowledge. Interestingly, before the processes of standardization of accounting rules, different oil companies calculated the depreciation of their undeveloped properties themselves in a variety of ways. And most of those ways were actually based on experience, literally. They used whatever they wanted to, and they just said, we have this experience, and therefore we can depreciate this however we want to. It's pretty amazing, right? The effect of defining each oil field as a cost center subject to depreciation differently was an overstatement of costs. So essentially what you were doing is you were saying that my expenses are higher. Now, if you're doing your own taxes, and I don't know who here does their own taxes, but if you're doing your own taxes, you know that you're looking for expenses, because the more expenses you can charge in, the less income you have that you're paying taxes on. And so that's basically what these companies were also doing, was that they were overstating their costs. Now, what the effect of this in turn is what Marxist theories of accounting, and there are some, believe it or not, trace to the US accounting profession's adoption of Irving Fisher's neoclassical economic ideas. So there is a particular way, and wasn't Irving Fisher a Chicago person? Anyway, so there is a particular way in which this kind of a neoclassical economics, you have to understate profits so you're not paying taxes on that, ends up being introduced in the particular methods of accounting for oil depreciation. The second element that the accountants did was something called transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is the practice of allocating costs and profits among related companies, like a parent and subsidiary, for example, which becomes significant when the goods are moved down the value chain across borders, and therefore they can be subject to different kinds of taxes. You guys are getting a lecture in accounting. Were you expecting that? My husband finds that sexy. I'm not so sure everybody else does. As Hannah Apple writes, tax havens, transfer pricing, and flags of convenience are central to the quotidian spectacular accumulation of capital in the oil industry. Transfer pricing begins to appear in congressional records, US congressional records, around this time, often categorized alongside refinery fuels, double dips, natural gas liquids, and comparative discounts as loopholes that oil companies are using in order not to pay taxes. It's also fascinating to see that when oilmen, for example, Jeffrey Chandler, who used to run Shell in Trinidad and Tobago, writes a piece for the Foreign Affairs Journal, and he talks about the congressional interest in transfer pricing as being scaremongering about our very professional practices. Of course, he's a Shell guy. He's going to say that, right? Anyway, so what is interesting is that as Prem Sikka and Hugh Wilmot have written in their essay on the dark side of transfer pricing in the United Kingdom, a purely technical conception of transfer pricing calculation abstracts them from the political economic context of their development and use. For example, in tax avoidance, but also in the one-way transfer of wealth from the producing countries to the states where the extractive companies are based. Now, the establishment of these rules of accounting over the course of the years after nationalization has basically allowed for a degree of freedom of operation for oil companies housed in the global north, which is not afforded to those in the global south. In the immediate aftermath of nationalization, most of the countries which produced the oil did not have the professional infrastructure needed for catching out the oil companies in their expatriation of profits. For example, in Kuwait, accounting as a profession only really emerges in 1973, more than a decade after the country had passed its own Companies Act and set up a stock exchange in 1960, and a year and after also ceasing to be a British protectorate. The fact that this establishment of an accounting was dependent on the graduation of the first cohort of accountants from the Kuwait University is itself a significant kind of an indication that many of these oil-producing countries after nationalization felt like they had to produce their own kinds of national standards about these processes. Before 1973, when this profession emerged, the Kuwait Oil Company depended on British auditors, specifically Pete Marwick, which are now incorporated into KPMG, auditing the company. And the only reason they did so was so that they could avoid the double taxation in the US and the UK. That's basically the only reason why they were subjected to audits, was just so that they wouldn't have to pay double taxes in the US and the UK. I mean, it's like a kind of a lawless, regulationless space until after nationalization. Now, why does this matter? Why have I put you guys all to sleep with this incredibly dense technical discussion of what often feels like arcane jargon intended to keep away prying eyes? Controversies over value and how value is assigned is a fundamental part of all socioeconomic practices, and singularly important to the transformation of objects into commodities, and therefore also to the processes of knowledge production and diffusion about these. The process of assigning value and tracing the shifts in the value of something becomes even more complex when the object that is being valued is invisible, ungraspable, dynamic across time, and can only be estimated, measured through proxies, for example, in mathematical or geophysical models, or ultimately imagined. Though I imagine the quantitative scientists among us may balk at the idea of imagination being at work here. To make the whole process of valuation, counting things, still more complex is the shift in the value of something, say, for example, in an energy resource, as it is extracted, transported, processed, refined, retailed, taxed, metabolized. Not only does the value of this energy resource change with practices of adding value, which labor goes into it, as Marx taught us, but also through the crossing of borders, and rather less intuitively when it moves between different departments of the same corporation. So I'm interested in this process of valuation as part of a larger project about the politics of valuation of oil wells or oil reservoirs. What I hope to argue is that this process of valuation is not only inscribed in the transformation of something into a commodity through human labor and the scientific detachment of these resources from the earth, but also the imposition of politics on the present and future value of energy resources. In other words, and I'm sure this group does not need me to say this, but that the price of oil and gas is fundamentally political. This may seem uncontroversial, but among some people that I even respect, who actually believe that there are people who actually believe that markets set prices. And you guys are smiling, but some of the people who actually say this are incredibly significant, quite left-wing folks who do believe that the market is in operation here. And if you want, I'll gossip with you afterwards about who it is, because it's being Zoomed. This larger project of which I'm hoping to work, and which I'm hoping to talk to you guys and hear your ideas about, is going to be what is the value of a well. The name is a play on a wonderful book by Adrienne Muller called The Value of a Whale, in which she tells us that IMF researchers posed a simple question: what is the value of a whale? The researchers settled on an even $2 million per specimen of great whales only, summing to an impressive $1 trillion for the global stock of whales. This obscene calculation summed projected revenues from whale tourism, which actually works to the detriment of the whales, and the ability of the great whales to sequester carbon, which of course is a mitigation to the production of carbon rather than a preventative measure. It assumes that living things can be commodified and that future value can be estimated based on quantifications and calculations that assume far too much. Again, people who know me know that Moby Dick is probably my single most favorite American novel. So I'm really offended by the fact that these people want to put a value of 2 million on Moby Dick. It's really shocking. The context that defines the value of the whale assumes ecotourism and the unabated production of carbon and the reliance of humans on the existing natural world to save us from capital's rapacious consumption and production of carbon. The models that make these calculations possible are taken as unassailable statements of fact And they in turn shape the reality of our treatment of whales. In the words of Donald MacKenzie in another context, these valuation models are engines, not cameras. So my obnoxious pun on value of a whale is, what is the value of a well? This question will frame a much larger project on the transformation of valuation in 4 specific areas having to do with the extraction of fossil fuels and the life cycle of an oil and gas well. These 4 specific areas are the geological evaluation of the volume of oil. And this is also interesting because I'm actually going to be in some ways betraying my father because he was an oil geologist. And so he believed in the science of geology. And the more of these geology textbooks I have read, the more clear it becomes that in fact, there is the science is in fact kind of a conversation more than an actual established set of facts. So geology, accounting evaluation of the costs and depreciation of this oil, financiers' evaluation of future projections of earnings that affect derivatives and other financial instruments, and conservationist evaluation of well as a stranded asset. I hope to excavate the methods by which such calculations are performed for 3 periods in time, between 1900 and 1960, 1960 and 1971, and between 1971 and the present. And part of the reason that I'm interested in this particular project is because the period between 1900 and 1960 is when the vast majority of commercial oil fields in the Caribbean and the Middle East were brought online. Between 1961 and 71, Britain and sterling ceded their hegemony and imperial holdings in the Gulf to the United States, and to the dollar, Bretton Woods ended, and the producers moved towards nationalization. And the subsequent period saw the cartel of Seven Sisters ceding their ability to set prices for a time to the state-owned oil companies in OPEC, and thereafter to oil traders, with the emergence of, for example, derivatives and the acceleration of production of plastics and petrochemicals. What I hope to recuperate is the political calculations that shape these valuations in different times and places. And I gave you guys a small flavor of the ways in which these particular accounting practices were entirely done through these kinds of political moments. What I'm arguing is that these shifts in methods of valuation, along with the legal apparatuses that undergird them, correspond to the cataclysmic shifts in the political economy of oil through nationalization, changes in market structure, and ebbs and flows of dominant energy sources. Here, I'm hesitant about using the word transition because, as Gökçe Günel, for example, has argued, and as, in fact, I think one of the papers tomorrow discusses, transitions are rarely linear. And as we've seen with the spike in the use of coal to feed data centers, possibly even reversible. The 4 methods of valuation I've chosen correspond to the specific claims of these areas about the verifiability of their measures. Geologists claim natural scientific certainties. Accountants rely on both customary and statutory rules of calculation. Financiers use projection and perhaps the most explicit evaluation of future political risk. And conservationist value seeks to put a number on the absence or lack. So I would love to hear from all of you whether this is a fool's errand, given that nobody is, I haven't heard any snoring, so I think maybe it's not, and learn from you about all the different ways that you think about oil and the prospect and project of valuing it through these technical and expert methods. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Is that coming through? Good, it's live. Well, thank you all. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for your metabolic intensification, which I'm going to try to catalyze here in a second. I want to also start off by thanking Neil and Fredrik and Victoria and Elizabeth and Ryan and all the other good people of SIGU who I haven't had a chance to meet yet. Thank you, Laleh, for an amazing talk from which I've learned so much already. It's really greatly honored and humbled to be with you today. So I have a thought or two about oil to share, which I'll begin with. And this is really This lecture is really a thought experiment in reimagining what we might mean by the term petrostate. But of course, if you say reimagine, then you have to give some attention to how we actually imagine the petrostate today. So as part of this experiment, and there will be earnest sections of this lecture and somewhat weirder sections, not frivolous, but weird and speculative sections of this lecture too. And one of the more artistic things I thought to do is maybe I'll plug this concept of petrostate into Midjourney, which is an AI graphic piece of graphic software. And it turned up a series of images that look like this. So, we all know that AI is not very intelligent. That's, I think, known. It's also not very artificial in the sense that what it really is kind of more of an automated unconscious in the Freudian sense of that term, a kind of a hidden epistemic reservoir of publicly circulating forms that then bubble up to the surface through picture puzzles and dream work and so on. And so these glimpses of petrostate come from a certain kind of epistemic gut, if you will. And I found them a little bit encouraging because here you have these ruined landscapes of enclosure and a sense of kind of the walls moving in and being hemmed in by this concept. And I thought that was encouraging because it shows that the dream work of the petrostate doesn't have a lot of space for utopia in it, at least not at the moment. And before I get started, I'll show you just two more images. This one on the left is not AI. This is the actual cover of Forbes magazine 50 years ago last week, which is the magazine in which the term petrostate first appears in print. I had reference librarians, a whole team of them, search for the first instance of the term petrostate. And this is where it appears, ironically enough, with a tank and a wind-up tank on top of it. As we know, that's not actually how tanks run. So that was interesting. And on the right, this is... On the right is an AI image, and this is what AI did with the metabolism of the petrostate. So I kind of liked this Rube Goldberg machine here, and I thought I'd leave it for a moment as a muse while I get started. So why talk about the petrostate today? Why not, as is more common, simply talk about the power of the oil and gas industry, or fossil fuel interests, or fossil capitalism? State theories typically define the state through the existence of a supreme authority, and Stuart Hall, among others, argues that the fundamental state function is rule, and that while rule can take many forms, it always involves, this is quoting Hall, the subjection of its subjects to the powers of the state, its domination over them. To guarantee rule, sometimes of laws, Weber spotlights the monopolization of legitimate violence as the critical feature of state domination. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the energo-political framework, I propose we need to pay greater attention to a problem that most state theories consider relatively trivial, that is how domination is accomplished. Since the late 19th century, the 1879 Zulu War is often mentioned. It has been essentially impossible to dominate anyone for any length of time without the use of fossil fuel infrastructure and the steel-based weaponry it makes possible. First, this dependence focused on the nexus of coal, steam, and steel, which provided the energo-material underpinning of state and imperial monopolies of violence after the 1850s, the Bessemer process, and so on. Then came the First World War, when tanks and warplanes and chemical weapons revolutionized combat again, and the state's ability to rule shifted decisively to dependence upon petroleum extraction. The point is simply that for nearly 2 centuries, fossil fuels have shaped rule, subjection, dominion in fundamental ways. And the hegemonic petropower of our times is agnostic to the mode of state rule, enabling liberal, illiberal, even state socialist regimes without hesitation. And it seems very comfortable operating outside the spotlight. The reason why we discount petropower is that oil seems like a commodity. It really does. A simple economic object traded by sovereign actors in markets. But in the spirit of Foucault's work with biopouvoir, biopower, I'd suggest an inverse way of thinking about what petropower is. What if petropower was itself sovereign and a source as opposed to simply a means of rule? As Hall observed, state power is a matter of capacity first and right afterwards. So too is petroleum a matter of capacity, of enablement in the truest sense of pouvoir, not as a noun but as a modal verb. That's the premise I'd like to explore in this lecture. It helps us to think about the tenacity and invisibility of petropower in the face of the climate emergency in new ways, perhaps, and to return to this concept of petrostate just once more. I mean state here not as a fixed political form, but rather in its classical sense as status, as a dynamic arrangement of power in all its conditions of possibility. So I want to offer 4 theses on the petrostate as a way of fleshing out this line of analysis further. The first is that we think the petrostate not as a nation-state scale entity at all. It is not a petrostate or petrostates that we should be concerned with. That is, countries whose national economies depend on some arbitrary percentage of oil revenue. Expert discourse on petrostates has been dominated by the resource curse meta-narrative, RCM, which defines petrostates, especially in the global south, as deviation from norms of neoliberal clientage. This limited concept of the petrostate maligns and caricatures the efforts of countries that seek to use petroleum to accomplish independent programs of national development. There are many cases, Chavez in Venezuela is one that comes to mind. What the RCM leaves blatantly unspoken is the capture of northern political institutions and dynamics by petropower. So instead of petrostates, we should think about the petrostate as fundamentally a global, or better yet, planetary assemblage. Even in its earliest booms in East Texas and Baku, petroleum exhibited world-shaping features. For example, in its rapid capture of transportation. But the 20th century world wars created a truly planetary petrostate for the first time. With that said, the petrostate also manifests nationally and locally in a more familiar institutional networks of roots and nodes, like oil companies. Secondly, the petrostate depends upon corporate power, but its network exceeds the corporate complex of parastatal and private oil exploration, extraction, and processing entities. The petrostate incorporates transnational socio-material systems like circulatory infrastructure, think tanker ships, think pipelines, and extraction zones, but it also involves epistemic engines like think tanks, media, and indeed universities. In addition, the petrostate manifests in the social organization of space around automobility, cities built for the convenience of cars, extending down to the level of petrol pumps and the extravagant fuel-guzzling SUVs that frequent them. It appears most intimately in petrochemical derivative compounds and abundant petroplastics that exploit the porosity of environments and bodies. Micro and nanoplastics scale the rule of the petrostate down to a cellular level. Third, the petrostate is thus at once more ubiquitous and tenacious than is normally assumed, but conversely, it is also more vulnerable. Here's some news I can share to you from Houston, one of the real epicenters of the petrostate as I see it. Whatever they tell you, the agents of the petrostate are already convinced that the petrostate has no future. The climate emergency is part of it. The staggering inefficiency of petro machines is another. The looming biopolitical threats of rampant plastic waste still another. China, perhaps the last great hope for growing global oil demand, just reached peak demand for oil as fuel. The gap between petroepistemic ideology and reality is expanding, much like the ideological overdrive of the last decades of European state socialism. The petrostate, while still immensely capable and dangerous, also feels senescent, droning on about the glories of the past as it struggles to kill the multitude of futures that would bury it. Petrostate ideology is not the only epistemic grounds for the white supremacist politics of the future called patriotic nostalgia these days, but it fuels all the others, quite literally. And as the most powerful political assemblage on the planet increasingly abandons empirical reality, it creates a permission structure for post-truth projects and occult thinking of all kinds. When I was growing up in Hyde Park in the 1970s and 1980s, the petrostate confidently and openly occupied both science and culture. Remember Mobile Masterpiece Theater? I used to watch that on Channel 11. The petrostate today is more like a damaged Terminator, with its decorative flesh hanging off and its steel skeleton and surveillance cameras exposed. But at least it's more obvious now what kind of killer it is that we're dealing with. Fourth and finally, the death of the petrostate is not guaranteed to come with the end of petroleum use. It is sustained by a complex infrastructural metabolism. But since it also depends on human beings, there are constant opportunities for trouble. To locate those opportunities, we need to pay attention to petrostate anabolics, the upscaling, resource-consuming forces that synthesize petrocultural forms, and petrostate catabolics, the disruptive forces that release stored energy so that the petrostate can adapt to new situations. Metabolism, like capitalism, maintains order by generating disorder. Yet even so, there may be xenobiotics, metabolically useless and potentially damaging forms of life that could stress the infrastructural metabolism of the petrostate enough to bring about its necessary downfall. You may remember from 8th grade biology that any creature needs a healthy balance of anabolism and catabolism to sustain itself. Examples of anabolism in biology include building protein from amino acids, synthesizing carbohydrates from sugar, and muscle growth and repair. Catabolism, meanwhile, involves processes like converting glycogen to glucose, breaking down triglycerides into fatty acids, and digestion. Ideally, anabolism and catabolism are reciprocal processes. For example, catabolism releases stored energy that anabolism can utilize for new growth projects. The infrastructural metabolism of the petrostate has similar dynamics. Petrostate anabolics include, among other activities, the capture of land and subsoil resources, the construction of petropolitical infrastructures, and the enrollment and enskillment of legions of workers and consumers of oil. Not all anabolic activities are equivalent, however, and if we wish to understand the current growth dynamics of the petrostate, we need to pay special attention to domains like military activity and petrochemicals. Globally, military activity uses about 3 times as much petroleum as civil aviation. The United States military accounts for about 3/4 of that activity alone, using over 100 million barrels of oil a year, a carbon footprint larger than countries like Portugal and Denmark. But the anabolic value of military activity to the petrostate exceeds routine fuel consumption. It is also about asserting subjection and domination over what Reza Negarestani terms anonymous materials of all kinds. The U.S. military's forever war in the Middle East is perhaps the most obvious instance. The constant presence of imperial war machines in the region with the largest petroleum reserves justifies the scale of the U.S. military-industrial complex as much as anything. A less obvious case of anabolic petropolitics is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Although Putin's aggression is most often described as a nostalgia for Soviet empire, the conflict has always concerned energy. Even before the Maidan Revolution and Viktor Yanukovych's ouster, a struggle over gas imports was brewing. Although Yanukovych's government is normally remembered as being pro-Russian, it actually presided over an almost 40% decrease in Russian gas imports. Worse still, the 2010 discovery of the giant Yuzivska gas field, the 3rd largest in Europe, threatened eventual Ukrainian independence from Russian petropower. With the near depletion of Ukraine's conventional gas fields, the development of Yuzivska held the potential to rebalance European energy politics for decades to come. Although Russian firms bid for the exploration and production partnership, Yanukovych's government announced in 2012 that Royal Dutch Shell and Chevron were the chosen partners. This move to bring Western oil majors into Ukraine unsettled Putin and his Gazprom allies. Shortly thereafter, they took advantage of the revolutionary moment in 2014 to move the battlefield closer to the gas field. Within a year, both Chevron and Shell had pulled out of their partnerships because of the violence. The significance of Yuzivska intensified after the 2022 invasion, with the brutal conflict over the town of Bakhmut being an excellent case in point. More than one news media report described Bakhmut like it was a random town of little strategic significance, in the words of Reuters. This is curious because the Bakhmut depression is precisely the southeastern edge of the Yuzivska field. Control over Yuzivska would considerably strengthen Putin's strategy of weaponizing Russia's gas exports while simultaneously thwarting competitive Ukrainian supply to Western Europe. Even rendering Yuzivska a militarized ruined no man's land would set Ukraine's movement towards energy sovereignty back for decades. I consider military conflict a good example of maintenance anabolics. Humming war machines help the petrostate to maintain its surface and subsurface territories, reminding the world that monopoly of violence is only guaranteed through the medium of fossil fuels. Where the petrostate is bulking up now, however, is in plastics. Throughout the oil industry, dreams are rippling of a plastic future that will offset the coming decline of oil burned for transportation. As of the beginning of this year, there were 132 petroleum refineries operating in the United States. Only 7 of them were built since the year 2000. The CEO of Chevron, Mike Wirth, said a few years ago that he doubted another new fuel refinery would ever be built in the United States. But Chevron and most of the other oil majors are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into building new plastic plants, like this new Shell chemical complex, the size of 300 football fields in Pennsylvania. It represents the largest industrial project in the state since the Second World War, with the capacity to produce 1.6 million tons of plastic pellets a year. Despite growing concerns about health and ecological damage caused by already overwhelming plastic pollution, energy research firm Wood Mackenzie expects that demand for naphtha and liquefied petroleum gas, 2 key petrochemical feedstocks, will grow 50% by 2050. Turning now to catabolics, I've argued elsewhere that the historical spine of the petrostate was automobility. The first 4 decades of petroleum extraction focused on providing light and heat, for example, producing kerosene as an alternative to whale oil. But it was transportation mechanics and logistics, from asphalt and road making to gasoline and engines, that allowed petroleum to make a state in its own image in the early decades of the 20th century. Once the core of petrostate anabolics, transportation has now become a site of catabolic activity, particularly as China and Europe race to replace internal combustion engines with electric alternatives. EV battery costs dropped at the end of 2024 to price parity with internal combustion engines for the first time, and will become 17% cheaper every time EV production doubles from here on out. As noted, the petrostate has contingency plans rooted in plastics and petrochemicals, but it is also forced to expend more energy today than in the past on generating disinformation to deny climate science, to slow down electrification, to cloud public understanding of the technical superiority of EVs and heat pumps, among other. Oil and gas companies spent $455 million on the 2024 US elections, just to guarantee a petrostate-friendly political agenda. But these are weird times. For that price, they probably didn't anticipate the White House becoming a Tesla showroom. Another important area of petrostate catabolics involves rearguard defensive maneuvers to guarantee that fossil fuels retain a significant share of electricity generation across the world. So we may go electric, but we still burn fossil fuels to get there. In my own little corner of the petrostate, Texas, this is clearly visible as the state government has become increasingly desperate and delusional in its efforts to limit renewable energy and battery development projects, despite the fact that these projects are the most affordable to consumers, the easiest to construct, and that Texas is already leading the nation in wind power, residential solar, and grid-scale battery installations. Natural gas, meanwhile, catastrophically underperformed during Winter Storm Uri in 2021, taking the island and Texas grid within a few minutes of collapse. Nonetheless, the Texas legislature is currently advancing more than one bill that would mandate 1 new megawatt of natural gas capacity for each new megawatt of wind, solar, and battery. A policy that Texas's most trusted grid expert, Doug Lewin, I recommend you follow his Substack if you're an energy nerd, described as, quote, the most heavy-handed anti-market kind of legislation he has ever seen in the history of Texas. Although until recently Texas was considered the free market paradise of energy development, we see the petrostate now working overtime to undermine cherished settler liberal principles of private property in a bid to keep fossil fuels from being swept out of the Texas grid by the better prices, technologies, and logistics of renewable energy. In the old days, petrostate metabolism attuned itself to the rhythm of booms and busts that had been the heartbeat of oil since its inception. Infrastructure was built, deployed, and then idled in rapid succession. Oil fields came and went, even as the easy oil of the first 70 years of the 20th century, as Stephanie Lemenager describes it, became the tough oil of the past 5 decades. Tough oil needs more capital, risk, and environmental damage for successful extraction. And I know what you're thinking. The petrostate metabolism has weathered so many crises that it seems invulnerable. Nothing, not peak oil phantoms, not the threat of nuclear energy, not pandemics or financial crashes has fundamentally disrupted the homeostatic balance of its anabolic and catabolic processes. Yet, I would argue that the petrostate has actually slipped rather quietly into a state of metabolic imbalance over the past 15 years. If you look at individual countries, the United States, for example, you might see the opposite, as we have become the largest petrostate in the conventional sense of the term in the history of the planet since the shale oil revolution of the early 2010s. But elsewhere in the world, again led by China, Europe, Latin America, the metabolic stress is clearer. The good news about the petrostate's metabolic imbalance is that it is burning a lot of its complex relationships and the stored energy therein along the way. Anabolism is about growth, yes, but also regeneration. The petrostate is stressed and working overtime to guarantee its dominion will extend for another generation. The petrostate, in other words, is starting to eat itself alive. It is beginning to die, but not nearly fast enough from the point of view of the climate emergency. So, what can be done? Staying within the paradigm of metabolism, let's talk about xenobiotics. The core idea of xenobiosis is that certain kinds of so-called foreign materials and agents can slow down or disrupt a creature's metabolic activity, like those petroplastics I just mentioned. But I find the assignation of foreignness particularly suspect, a reminder of the way that ecological and metabolic theories co-evolved with liberal and imperial ideas about bounded bodies and racial hierarchies. As Zoe Todd reminds us, even the sinister plague of petroplastics can be seen through another lens as the weaponization of ancient algal kin. So while I do like the idea of meddling with petrostate metabolism, I think xenobiosis needs some creative reformulation politically. And in that spirit, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, here is a small bestiary of xenobiotes that illustrates some of the disruptive and decompositional tactics that could be applied toward the petrostate. The first category of xenobiotes are the kaiju. If we learn nothing else from Godzilla, it's that sometimes to disable one mega-scale monster, you have to find another mega to take it on. The ideal kaiju to take on the petrostate would be a functional, reasonable, humane global government. But because what the petrostate fears above all is a global regulatory apparatus, its legions of agents relentlessly demonize, mock, and undermine the prospect of global political movements and institutions of all kinds. For the moment, we have to rely on lesser kaiju like finance, the second most wealthy and powerful industry in the world, plus a Frankenstein's monster of nation-state and municipal political initiatives. None of these have proven durable adversaries to the petrostate as of yet, but sometimes working in combination, they can effectively put stress on the petrostate metabolism for periods of time. The problem with kaiju is that while their political potential is immense, like all monsters, they are ponderous and impossible to control. If you're trusting finance to bring down the petrostate, in other words, you should probably rescale your expectations for salvation because no one tells Godzilla what to do. A second category of xenobiotes occupies a more human scale and is prone to trickery, misdirection, and mischief. I am speaking, of course, of changelings. This room, for example, is filled with very respectable professional intellectuals. Collectively speaking, you have excellent taste in eyeglass frames, wine, and shoes. But perhaps at night, some of you dress in black and join a group like the tire extinguishers who deflate SUV tires to irritate the owners and vendors of the neighborhood tank fleet. Maybe your idea of a good time is not hopping on a flight to nowhere, but rather re-enchanting the landscape already at hand in the manner of the Situationists' Delive. Perhaps you make your own clothes, perhaps you avoid plastics, maybe you secretly engage in what Stacey Alimo calls ecodelic activities instead of the normative petro-thrills available to us. For the rule of the petrostate to proceed with minimal metabolic stress, the petrostate would greatly prefer if we were all to stay in our subject positions and behave in predictable ways. So let's not do that. Let's become a shape-shifting, irritating presence within petroculture. As humans, let's foot drag, evade, slander, and sabotage. But changelings are also more than human. An EV is a kind of a shapeshifter, so is a heat pump. So is public transportation. We need lots and lots of pod beings to snatch bodies away from the petrostate and replace them with uncanny replicants. The third category of xenobiotes are subjects equipped to resist and occupy the petrostate at smaller scales. As I noted before, even if we stopped extracting and burning fossil fuels today, micro and nano petrokin would continue battling us at a cellular level for many years to come. So we need to foment xenobiosis there too. In our chaotic and flimsy manifesto, Hyposubjects, Timothy Morton and I speculate about the kinds of political potentialities that this era of hyperobjects and hypersubjects have unleashed. Among the characters in that book are the micronauts, a class of subsengent kaiju, if you will, figures who pursue heroic adventures across the microverse. Indeed, their revolutionary metabolic activities are happening right now, among other places, in your own bodies, which are less like sealed jars, I'm sorry to say, and more like a porous, multitudinous ecology of bacteria, fungi, and viruses far exceeding your own so-called human cells. You couldn't digest food nor claim a functional immune system without these micronauts. But how could they help end the petrostate? Some bacteria eat oil, others dissolve plastic, so they may prove to be among our most important allies in the long game of decomposing petroculture. Their adventures are not ours to imagine and steal. Still, I think their pouvoir deserves our respect. There are only two species in the history of the planet that have decisively transformed the life world of every other species they cohabited with. One of them is us, Homo sapiens. The other are the cyanobacteria who oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere over 2 billion years ago. As I bring this experiment in thinking about the metabolism of the petrostate to a close, I want to acknowledge my Marxist comrades in the room still grumbling to themselves about my casual dismissal of fossil capitalism at the beginning of my talk. I see you. I feel you. Why do I consider fossil capitalism a manifestation of the petrostate and not vice versa? In some ways, it builds very much on what Fredrik said at the beginning. Fossil capitalism would not exist at its current scale or with its signature political impunity or with its accelerating death drive without a foundational infrastructural relationship to rule, subjection, and domination. Rather than placing fossil fuels CEOs in the prisons that await them, climate scientists are persecuted for timid reminders that the petro-status quo is unsustainable. To call this situation fossil capitalism, I think, is to misjudge, and I would argue to underestimate its political scale and capacity. If we were just struggling to overcome fossil capitalism, we would have overcome it a while ago. Consider that over half of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions have taken place in the last 30 years, a time in which the world allegedly knew better than to continue burning fossil fuels. The opportunities for capital to innovate, electrify everything, and establish new energy rents have been there for a long time, at least since the peak nuclear era of the 1960s and 70s. Isn't the promise of capitalism that everything solid is eventually supposed to melt into air? The state, meanwhile, is about the consistency of rule and domination. It has no interest in orderly or necessary transitions. And so I'll just ask you, which dynamic do you think better represents our relationship to fossil fuels, capitalist or state? But I will concede that the petrostate, as I'm articulating it here, is a blurry and even slightly magical category. But I'll also say that if we Marxists, and I do identify as such, are being honest with ourselves, so is capital, a slightly magical category. Capital for Marx was a dimension of the objectification of human labor power, specifically a result of how the division of labor severed labor's development of human capacities, both individually and as a species. Instead of an ideal dialectical process of self-realization, capital alienated labor power in a way that could circulate beyond the self, be appropriated and commanded by others, thus transformed into new social and material forms. As Marx wrote in the first chapter of Das Kapital, as values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. But there's an interesting twist to this story. Congelation, from the Latin verb congelare, to freeze together, is actually a slightly misleading translation of the actual noun Marx uses in that passage, gallert, which refers to a gelatinization process in which different animal substances, meat, bone, connective tissue, are boiled and then cooled to produce glue. Rather than a freezing together of independent parts, Gallert indicates an ontological transformation through thermal energy, a recipe of different fleshy forms rendered into a single sticky material. Burkett and Foster argue that this galert of capital is more than just metaphor. Their view is that there is a powerful energometabolic substrate to Marxist theories of labor power, alienation, and value extraction. On the topic of surplus value, they write, quote, "This value surplus is not really created out of nothing. Rather, it represents capitalism's appropriation of the portions of the potential work embodied in labor power recouped from metabolic regeneration, largely during non-work time." In other words, capital becomes an appropriation, quite literally, of anabolic fleshy power, a sapping and storage of the regenerative potential of being. I love this reading of Marx, and I don't even care if Burkett and Foster, like Kohei Saito more recently, imbue Marx with a greater ecological sensibility than he might deserve. My point is just that this rather mystical vision of capital as stored life energy is actually quite consistent with the vision of petrostate metabolism I've just sketched out here. Petroleum is literally stored life energy, a buried son of algal corpse juice. The combustion of that corpse juice enables a remarkable variety of machinic processes, which in turn enable a variety of forms of productivity, violence, mobility, and plasticity. When you take all of those processes and forms in their totality, there you have a petrostate, which, much like capital, seems to have a life of its own. But not for long, that much I can promise you. The petrostate, I repeat, is dying. But how it passes out of this world into the next one, whether in quiet hospice or in swarms of genocidal, ecocidal violence, that is the political question of our times. Thank you.
Wow, those were such exhilarating, high-octane presentations. Now we're going to slow down for a bit and take questions. We'll go on till 7:05. We were initially supposed to stop at 6:45, but we'll carry on till 7:05. Can I ask everyone to maybe, ask questions in clusters, and we'll ask Dominic and Laleh to answer them in sort of clusters as well. So if you can try to be short with your questions, that would be very helpful.
For both presenters, I'm a little bit concerned that we are seeing the replacement of imperialism of UK with imperialism of US. And in the Middle East, a lot of people thought that, great, you're getting liberated from UK. So it seems that in both of your presentation, you see this emergence of finance state as somehow kind of liberating humanity from the petrostate, because the same discourses about taxes, experts, everything that you said goes on right now with the big companies that are deregulating everything. So aren't we thinking about an older enemy here and forgetting about the bigger emerging threat?
So, Chris?
Yeah, I had two questions for Laleh. The first is, what is the value theory that you're working with on the project? Because it seemed at times that you were switching back between value and price, perhaps. And the second related question is, if in fact you're working with a more Marxian labor theory of value, I wonder if that would apply to the oil industry, because as you show, oil, and maybe you don't agree with this, but the oil industry seems more structured as a rent. So even though these oil companies book profits, their prices are politically controlled and set, also via these kind of accounting techniques that you demonstrate. So how are you thinking about profit versus rent as it relates to capital? Yes.
Fredrik, maybe your question, then we can.
Yeah, okay, sure. For both of you, it seems like the common ground here is a theory of growth, or an idea of growth, right? Petrostates may not follow the logic of capital exactly, but they certainly have embraced a notion of growth, right? And partly through military rule, but also through biopolitics of different kinds. So I'd like to hear more about that, Dominic. And likewise for you, this seems like your 4 layers of valuation of the oil well all have to do with different ideas of growth, right? It's really following up on what Chris said. It seems like
a geological, a mineral endowment-oriented notion of growth would be quite different from the financial discount model you mentioned. So could you just walk us through maybe the epistemic nuances there?
No, why don't you go? That allows me to think about value of the value theory I'm using.
So on finance, I don't think, and I'm sorry if I gave that impression, that finance is guaranteed to sort of save us from the world of oil and petropower. I think there are people who believe that's possible, and there's a lot of people who work in green, so-called green finance and green capitalism, who believe that, you know, capital is a kind of a neutral political technology that can be applied towards different purposes, and if you put it towards more sustainable purposes, I mean, there's a lot of capital that's being invested and organized according to that idea. And, you know, whereas I think capital can successfully like lead to certain kinds of transition projects, I'm not doubting that. I don't think that there's any evidence or much evidence to suggest that that left to their own devices, that these companies are actually going to produce something that is actually fundamentally dealing with the reasons why we might have to build wind parks and solar farms right now. And at least the research I did in Mexico, which was on the Mexican renewable energy transition, the wind rush in Oaxaca, showed that the kinds of renewable energy that was being developed were very much in an extractive mode, mode of enclosure and extraction. So unfortunately, I don't think that's really the answer. And then to the question of growth, I guess I would just say that, you know, certainly my thinking of this is steered by the great Timothy Mitchell and his work in Carbon Democracy, and his sense that growth is a kind of petro-knowledge, that there wasn't really an obsession with growth in the same way until you hit this moment. And I'm sure this could be challenged historically. I would challenge it actually historically. But this idea that it has something to do with a certain moment of oil's development, when it was seeming to be ever reducing in price, ever expanding in availability, and thus, you know, the one material that enabled all these other productive processes to proceed, because that was seeming to be a trivial aspect of the value equation, meant that, of course, you could expect infinite growth. But I would argue, just in the No More Fossils book, I talk about growth more in the line of what Sid Mintz talks about with Sweetness and Power, that really it's a deeper hunger, a thirst that's built into these sucropolitical, as I call them, dynamics of plantation culture, that's a better origin point for thinking about growth, in which case it is something that's more fundamental to transnational capital.
I've got it. So I'm not sure that I at all talked about regulation or finance being a liberation from the empire. If anything, I'm saying that it in fact actually intensifies the imperial control. At a moment of nationalization, those regulations and the emergence of financial instruments, et cetera, all actually assure that the accumulation of capital in the global north goes on. So no, I'm not looking at finance, or even green finance, or BlackRock, whatever, the environmental, social, and governmental kinds of requirements, in fact, doing any of that. And if anything, they just reproduce new modalities of capital accumulation. So I'm definitely not looking to finance. I'm interested in finance, though, because I do think, and there's quite a lot of recent research that shows that the emergence of these new modalities of finance and the sort of re-emergence of futures and derivatives, which had William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, which is actually about Chicago and talks about the history of futures. And you see a kind of a receding of those financial instruments based on futures contracts until the 1970s, as a response, I think, to nationalization. And so I think that that finance ends up becoming this kind of an alternative modality or additional modality of accumulation. So I'm definitely not looking to finance as a kind of a rescue. I was really afraid of that question about my value theory. And let me just put it in a kind of a let me put it aside for a moment and explain what my purpose is. I don't start with an a priori kind of a theory of value, in part because what I'm really interested in is how in these different four fields, the geologists, the accountants, the financiers, and the conservationists, and here the conservationists are not actually environmentalists. Conservation originally emerges as a terminology within actually the oil industry, and actually I think it emerges in East Texas after the Spindletop well is discovered, as a way of keeping oil in the ground in order to ensure prices remain high. And so that word conservation also ends up emerging again really enormously in the 1970s during the energy crisis in this country. And so conservation ends up becoming a modality for creating artificial scarcity in order to sort of prop up prices, right? And so what I'm really interested in is in how do these four categories of people who do valuing, how do they do the calculation? So I'm really not starting with an a priori position, and then this goes to the response to the sort of how am I incorporating the geological and biological and natural sort of world into this is Fernando Coronel. That there is a kind of that there's a way in which obviously I think labor matters. I think the fact that petrochemicals and plastics end up becoming so enormously significant after nationalization is precisely because the countries of the global north want a new way of adding value and extracting value out of oil, and therefore you suddenly see these, like all of Rotterdam in Europe is the world's biggest oil port, actually bigger even than Texas. And all of the, I think it used to have 9, it now has 7 refineries. And out of those 9, the original 9, 6 were set up in the 1970s in order to add value to the oil that was coming from the newly independent nations in order to then have a product that was value added. So labor obviously mattered, right? And a labor theory of value has to be taken into account here. But so are other things. And I think that that's partially why the Coronel kind of pricing of nature and the way that he wants to think about unequal global nature, so that nature is valued differently here than it is, for example, in Iran or Venezuela or Kuwait or whatever, is also partially where it goes into it. I don't, again, on epistemology of that also of growth, I also don't have an a priori position, obviously, other than being definitely degrowth, because I think that, sort of the idea that you're constantly accumulating has to stop if we really want to survive. But I don't, it's not a very good Marxist of me or any kind of theorist of me, but I don't begin with an a priori position. Mostly because I trained as a chemical engineer at University of Texas in a department where petroleum engineering was. And so what I'm interested in is how things work rather than telling them to work in a particular way.
One thing, you're a better Marxist not being a priori.
Thank you.
Secondly, one of the things that changed my attitude about accounting was Michael Power's Audit Society. And my favorite thing about that book is the extent to which he explains how auditors and accounters, let's just be vulgar about it, pull their categories out of their power-laden butts and then apply them to everybody and turn it into quantitative numbers that they can analyze. I kind of get that sense that that's what you're saying about oil, and I really like it because that's how this question of setting price and establishing value by means of power, not production. And I think that feeds into your material on the state. My concern about the material on the state is, are you a good Marxist if you're not talking about the state coincident with capital? And this is actually my problem with Foster. Foster has no theory of the state beyond the work he did on monopoly capital, which is the state is totally captured by capital, and therefore we don't have to think about it. It's just nature and capital, right? So I really like the that price and value is about power as much as it is about the materiality of production. And I really like the ways in which the state is fundamental to this question. And the problem with a lot of Marxists is you talk about the economy as if it's not fundamentally embedded.
Thanks. My head is sort of roaring, so I don't know that this is going to come out as coherent questions. But I guess, I mean, for Dominic, coming back to your comments on petrochemicals and plastics, it strikes me that the kind of microscopic dimension of that problem is the microplastics in the bodies of living things. The other scale of that problem is the kind of ghost acres of materiality for which all those plastics are serving as substitutes. And I wonder kind of how you're thinking about that scale of transformation, what it would actually mean for this number of people on the planet to be living in a world in which, at this point, petrochemicals cannot be substituting for all of the things that they currently are. And Laleh, I don't know whether this will end up being a question, but Chris said rent and you said Coronil, and there's this interesting moment in Coronil where he points out that the way that the Venezuelan government is able to secure the first 50-50 profit sharing arrangement is thanks to the way the US tax code is structured. Which then actually becomes the source of the conflict in Iran because the British basically say that the American public may be too stupid to understand what's going on, but the British taxpayers will not subsidize the petroleum company. And on that basis, I mean, this relates to Alan's comment about the state. It seems like part of what's going on here is that the kind of conceptual categories that would distinguish tax from rent from profit through these techniques of accounting are actually shown. I mean, they are stabilized by the techniques of accounting, but they do not exist in the world on their own. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess one can do a variety of things with that. So a kind of historical question is, what do you then do with the fact that the kind of two largest confrontations with concessionaries in the middle of the 20th century are with companies in which the British state itself owns a massive controlling share. So the Suez Canal and Anglo-Persian oil are the objects of these massive geopolitical struggles, and they do not function like normal capitalist corporations because they are in fact owned in very large share by the British state. So yeah, I mean, the question is sort of what does this do to like frontier state theory ideas about tax, revenue, profit?
Can I go?
Yeah, we'll take one.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a question for Dominic. So I really appreciate the sort of the seriousness of the talk, but also the playfulness that's sort of threaded throughout. And I guess this is sort of an attempt to bring the early part of the talk together with the later part, where you experiment, I guess you could say, with a sort of Foucauldian notion of sovereign power, where you talk about petropower as functioning as a form of sovereign power. And then at the end of the talk, I thought it was really interesting that you sort of started talking about xenobiotics, but xenobiotics functioning not in the way they're traditionally thought about as coming from the outside as exterior, but actually, and this is what gets me thinking about the sort of Foucauldian elements, if you like, of your talk and the way you're thinking about power, is because it reminds me, or at least the way you're outlining three scales of counterconduct that actually function, that have to come from, if you like, within the regimes of power. And these xenobiotics seems to be operating at three very different scales, at the planetary regulatory scale, at the individual body, but also at the level of sort of the microscopic level. So I'm wondering, first of all, would you buy that idea that these are forms of counterconduct that don't necessarily come from the outside, but need to sort of emerge from within, the way sort of Foucault thought about it? And then I guess second of all, how would you think about these sort of three scales relating? Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Should we maybe take one last question so that would be the final round?
Okay.
Casey?
Yeah. Thank you for your talks. I I guess in contrast to all the questions about the state, also how are you thinking about non-state actors as well, like various insurgencies or labor? And given the fact that in the current oil economy, how risk is also calculated takes into account oil sabotage and also piracy as well, especially in West Africa and also in Latin America. Like, how does these accounting factors go into your theories or frameworks in general?
Can we also have one more person, because it's a woman asking, and there have been mostly guys asking questions.
I appreciate it, thank you. I am curious, this is for you, Laleh, so I'm curious to hear more about these Marxist theories of accounting, which I was blissfully ignorant to. So Irving Fisher's neoclassical economic theory basically takes up that everything can be accounted for, and he doesn't really have this concept of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know more about these scholars who you're working with, but also how you deal with these Marxist theories of accounting in your own work.
Okay. Why don't you go first?
No, you go.
Okay. Thank you very much for the comment that you think by not having a priori theories, I'm actually, I always find that a little bit difficult to defend because in a lot of settings, I think you do need to state that. And as I said, I'm here a complete student of what it is that I'm hoping to study, and I don't come into it with accepted or scriptural notions of what Marxism is supposed to be, in part because my father was a scriptural Marxist. And so again, everything is done in this kind of, when you get to my age, to this kind of a Freudian fighting your father sort of thing. And so that's why the geologists and etc., but also partially why I bridle a little bit at this, at going at it with a particularly preset notion of what a Marxist theory is going to be. Also because Marxism means something completely different in the global south often, emerging as it does and in combination as it does with actual movement rather than coming out of a theoretical setting, often as it does nowadays in the global north. So thank you for that. Oh gosh. Okay, so I've always had a problem with the idea of rent, even as it appears in Marx. It's like, why is it that certain categories are assigned the value of rent when actually what they are is what one group of subalterns, sometimes geopolitically subaltern, but sometimes also that end up enjoying that value. So why is that becomes rent and it's accounted for, calculated differently? In fact, I remember when I was a grad student and I was learning how to be a social scientist because I'd been an engineer, it just never made sense to me. And I'm sure that I need to be better indoctrinated in order for it to make sense to me, but I just find the idea of rent very different than almost any of the other concepts. It just doesn't fit anything. And so Coronial, in some ways, actually questions that as well. And I think that that's what makes it so fabulous, makes the book so revealing, is that, yeah, the idea of rent emerges because the US tax code said that, in fact, for other kinds of mining, this is what's going on. In terms of the big corporate states, I do think that the BP and the Suez Canal Company were a little bit like the East India Company, and they functioned like the East India Company for the British. They really did, in every way. I think the ways they dealt with it, the regulations around it, the semi-statal function of it, everything about them is like that. And I think when you see that, then you can't unsee it. So the way that they treat it, the way that it functions, the way that they think about it, the way that their nationalization ends up activating British government activity, all makes sense. So to me, that's what's going on with that. The Marxist accountant, it's a 2-volume book. His name is Rob Breyer, B-R-Y-E-R. He's an emeritus professor in the UK, but he's written he may be American originally, but he's got a 2-volume book. actually everything that he's written tons of books. Everything he's written is on LightGen, so you can download it there, because they are very difficult to find. But his 2-volume book on sort of the emergence of accounting standards in the US was revelatory to me.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you. And I think I only have a few minutes. I want to try to be pithy, but still, every question is due. Yes, I think you're totally right to be a good Marxist, and I'm not claiming that I am one. I'm a lapsed Marxist, a little bit of a lazy Marxist sometimes, but it is kind of where my journey into critical theory began, and I still feel a great fidelity to Uncle Carl. But I agree with you, for just reasons that Laleh was saying. You mentioned Hannah Appel's work, and there's so many different ways in which transnational oil and energy companies take on these quasi-state-like or parastate-like functions. They have to be considered together. And I think in a longer, more, sort of detailed version of this paper, which I'm really testing out here for the first time. So thank you again for your patience and with my weird idea. But the weird idea is simply this, right now our concept of the petrostate is that it's a kind of exception to norms of modern sovereignty and rule. And I would like to think about what if it weren't? What if it were actually the norm? So in other words, what if every state is a petrostate, or every state has petrostate-like functions and activities? How would that change our understanding of the critical challenges we face, and also make us maybe understand where the intransigency comes from? Because I think it's deeper than simply a matter of capital. So I think it's a terrific point. I really enjoyed your point. I think you said ghost acres, which is a beautiful concept. I don't know where that's coming from, but if it's just you,
no, it's not.
Poetically done. So, okay, lovely. I'll have to look that up. I take from that question, I think, an important point that does go to this degrowth question. I think also, in many ways, the kind of modernity, including the modern population and its habits, largely skewed towards the global north, of course, because, the 1% of wealthiest people on this planet burn 50% of the carbon emissions. So this is not all humanity we're talking about, but some humanity have been able to get away with a lot because of the dominant energy density and politics that are associated with that. So I think that when we're thinking about what it would take to sustainably replace that, which I kind of thought was where your question was going, it really is a bigger challenge, and I'm glad you're pointing to that. I think it should be the kind of thing that people are talking about more in the degrowth conversation. And again, I find it curious that some of our more illustrious contemporary degrowth figures don't really talk about what they owe to a figure like Andre Gortz, who coined the term degrowth as décroissance back in the 70s. And I think his work is really interesting, but for him, it's clearly a socialist politics. It's like a world of universal durable goods, necessities for everyone, luxuries for no one. And I think there's a kind of like that weird abundance book that Ezra Klein just published. There's this weird effort to kind of repackage some kind of, growth mantra into degrowth, or to negate it in that way, that I'm really concerned about. That's the political message going forward, is like, oh, we can still have all of this stuff. We can see, we don't have to worry about that because of technology or because of organization of power. And then thank you. I just want to thank you so much for that. I thought very astute and kind reformulation of the parts of the talk. Your appreciation for the playfulness of it, which I think is important. I spent a long time studying the revolutionary politics of the Best Party in Iceland, which is the mayor Mayor Jon Gunnar, who became the mayor of Reykjavik, running on an anarcho-surrealist platform after the financial crash, and inspired Volodymyr Zelensky to run for president of Ukraine, incidentally. And the fact that they were able to fundamentally disrupt the common sense and even the procedures of Icelandic politics through a mode of politics that was based on a kind of stand-up, call it like a humane version of the Trumpism, that I think, of that kind of populist Trumpism, that I think there is something to the role of play or the ludic dimension of politics and transformation we have to pay attention to. It can't all just be hard work and serious business. That buys back into the 19th century economies of austerity and thrift that Kara Daggett has written so brilliantly about as part of the logic of modern energy. Counterconduct, yes, absolutely. I think there's a way of seeing it in that way. Simply for me, it's a way of trying to think about what are the kind of charismatic figures, positions, not charismatic in a Weberian sense, but in the sense of something that could capture political imagination in new ways of organizing ourselves. Because I think some of the more successful efforts to attack, negate, undermine petroculture, like people like the tire extinguishers, are people who are doing this also in a playful way, also in a way that captures imagination and mobilizes people around something not simply about negation, though we know negation is important. So all I would add to it is I don't think it's just about humans in this too. I really do think that this is a bit more than human problem at this point and will require more than human alliances. And so I don't think we should forget, although it seems silly to bring bacteria into a conversation about the politics of the petrostate, I actually think it's, there's going to be a lot of plastic out there that we're going to have to find a way of not getting into our bodies, right? Who else can help us with that? Not big nets.
Can I comment on your so on the tire extinguishers?
Yeah.
Do you guys know the geographer Stephen Graham, who wrote about destroying? He wrote a series of really fantastic British geographer Stephen Graham wrote a series of really wonderful stuff after the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. About the sort of the herbicide that was happening there, and he was caught keying SUVs in Newcastle in Britain and got a suspended sentence for that. So that's the first thing. The second thing was about the non-human. I was at an exhibition in Bangalore. They have this amazing science museum where job of the Science Museum is to offer a scientific subject to artists, commission them to produce artwork, and make that available to public. And the one that they had me speak at was carbon, and they actually had a plastic chair that was in real time being eaten by fungi. And you could see it. So it had been there when I went to give the talk. It had been there for 5.5 months, and half of the plastic chair was eaten. So fungi are our friends.
We have an entire day tomorrow of learning, talking, and discussing to look forward to. But until then, let me request all of you to thank Laleh and